A judge, long corrupted by her own hubris, sneered at him, and in that moment, her entire dominion crumbled before every watchful eye in the cavernous courtroom. In the humid confines of a Santa Ana courtroom, where murmurs rolled like distant thunder, Judge Evelyn Cartwright delicately pushed her spectacles up while her meticulously manicured fingers tapped a lazy, rhythmic tattoo upon the time-worn wooden bench. She had overseen countless cases, each one dissolving into the next, every defendant merely a nameless echo in a sea of sorrow. At the defendant's table stood Lawrence Bonetta, a sharply attired black man in his late 40s. His suit was immaculate and his posture as upright as a sentinel's. Yet none of his dignity registered with Cartwright, who barely deigned to glance from her towering stack of documents. To her, he was nothing more than a disposable case file, a mere number in a never-ending ledger of misfortune. Leaning back in her chair, a condescending smile played on her lips, a smile that spoke of predetermined judgments. "Ah, Mr. Bonetta," she drawled with a tone as brittle as autumn leaves, "let me guess, this is just a colossal misunderstanding, or perhaps the scales of justice are simply tipped against you." Her words dripped with derision as a ripple of suppressed chuckles passed through the gallery. The hulking bailiff, a man who had silently stood by her side for years, allowed a sly smirk to cross his rugged features. Meanwhile, the young prosecutor, eager to impress yet not immune to the subtlest hints of irony, kept her gaze fixed on her scribbled notes, though a faint curl of amusement betrayed her composure. Lawrence, however, remained unruffled, standing calm as a still lake amid a brewing storm. He waited patiently for the echoes of her laughter to subside before he addressed her in a measured tone. "Your Honor, I believe that if you were to peruse the case file with any care, you'd realize that I am not the accused here." For a split second, Judge Cartwright's smirk faltered, her eyes blinked in disbelief. "Pardon? What did you just say?" she demanded, her voice a tremulous mixture of confusion and indignation. Lawrence inclined his head ever so slightly, replying coolly, "I am not the defendant in this trial. In fact, I am the very person who set this case in motion." A dense silence fell over the room. The judge's eyes darted to the open file before her, her manicured fingers curling tightly around its edges as if grasping for control. Something felt dreadfully amiss, though she would never concede that vulnerability. Instead, she scoffed theatrically, rifling through the pages with exaggerated care, and then demanded, "Then why, pray tell, are you standing at the defendant's table?" Without warning, Lawrence slipped his hand into the inner sanctum of his tailored jacket pocket. The prosecutor stiffened visibly, the burly bailiff instinctively stepped forward, one hand hovering near his holster as if anticipating calamity. Judge Cartwright's eyes narrowed into slits of suspicion. But when Lawrence produced a sleek, well-worn leather wallet and casually flipped it open, the very air in the courtroom shifted. The ambient hum gave way to a stifling stillness. Every murmur evaporated as the judge's smirk vanished in an instant. Gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights was a badge, a United States Secret Service insignia that shimmered with undeniable authority. And that, it turned out, was merely the prologue. The judge's lips parted in silent shock, yet no words emerged. Her gaze oscillated between the gleaming badge and Lawrence's impassive face, as though she were reinterpreting every detail of the unfolding scene. The prosecutor's posture stiffened even further as she stole a furtive glance at the judge, while the bailiff involuntarily recoiled a step. Moments before, the gallery had been entertained by Cartwright's callous mockery. Now, its occupants sat enshrouded in stunned, reverent silence. Lawrence held the badge aloft just long enough for every eye to register its stark message before slipping it back into his pocket. His tone, cool and unwavering, sliced through the hush. "I was undercover, investigating corruption." His words, delivered with the same even cadence as before, now struck the courtroom like a sharpened blade. "And Judge Cartwright," he continued, "your name has echoed through our investigations more times than you can imagine." A slow, uneasy exhale escaped the judge's lips, she who had always relished control, the one who casually wielded her gavel to shape destinies. But now, a strange pressure coiled around her heart, something long dormant stirring within. Her grip on the gavel grew taut. "Excuse me," she stammered, her voice stripped of its customary acerbic edge. Lawrence exhaled deliberately, savoring the silence before continuing. For the past 6 months, we have been unraveling a vast network of judicial corruption in Orange County, bribes, unlawful sentencing, collusion with private prison magnates, and a conspicuous pattern of draconian rulings disproportionately targeting black defendants. A brittle, almost hysterical laugh burst from Judge Cartwright. "This is absurd," she scoffed. "Is this some kind of farcical jest?" Lawrence did not rise to meet her derision. Instead, he calmly reached into his pocket once more and withdrew a neatly folded document. Advancing slowly, he placed it squarely on the bench before her. Cartwright hesitated, then carefully unfolded the paper. Her eyes raced over the meticulously printed letterhead and the decisive signature that closed the missive, a formal notice from the Department of Justice, announcing an active investigation, with her name emblazoned among others. Her throat constricted painfully. This was no ruse. She opened her mouth to protest, to dispute, to dismiss, but no sound emerged. In that instant, the courtroom no longer belonged to her. Her hands trembled as she methodically gathered the incriminating documents, pressing them onto the bench as if sheer force might make them vanish. Yet no amount of judicial pageantry could undo the irreversible truth laid bare before them. The soft murmurs that had begun in the gallery swelled into a profound undercurrent of realization, as those who had long revered the weight of her gavel now perceived the very fissures undermining her reign. The young prosecutor's pen lay abandoned on her legal pad, and the once assured bailiff shifted his stance imperceptibly. Lawrence, however, continued to watch, steady, vigilant, waiting for the final reckoning. "Your arguments are nothing but grasping at straws," Cartwright finally hissed, her voice taut with desperation. "There is no concrete proof, only speculative, cherry-picked cases." Before she could press further, a resonant new voice cut through the tension. "That is not true, Your Honor." A man in his mid-50s, his temples edged with silver and clad in a dark blue suit, rose from the gallery. He introduced himself as Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Whitaker. The atmosphere in the courtroom transformed in an instant. Cartwright's pallor deepened. "We have amassed evidence for months," Whitaker declared, stepping forward with the gravity of finality. "We're talking bribery, case-fixing, intentional over-sentencing in exchange for political favors." He then turned toward the court clerk. "Would you kindly read the docket number for the federal filing against Judge Cartwright?" The clerk, momentarily hesitant, looked down at her screen and responded in a clear, measured tone, "Case number 204C-R 1785. A collective exhale swept through the gallery as Cartwright's mask of authority began to crumble. "This is outrageous," she hissed, a feeble, disgraced retort. Whitaker's tone sharpened as he continued, "Effective immediately, you are officially under investigation and removed from the bench. Federal authorities will escort you from this courthouse." In a futile grasp at power, Cartwright's fingers clenched around her gavel as if a single, forceful slam might reverse fate. But for the first time in decades, she was not the one dictating orders. 2 federal marshals strode into the courtroom, electrifying the air. All eyes fixed on the judge, once the epitome of unassailable authority, now trembling as she awaited judgment. A tall marshal with cropped brown hair stepped closer, her voice resonant and unyielding. "Judge Cartwright, please step down." Desperation etched across her face. Cartwright scanned the room as if seeking a defender in the sea of indifferent onlookers. Her gaze fell briefly on the prosecutor, but the young woman met it with an inscrutable, almost detached focus on her legal pad. Even the bailiff, his hand clutching his radio, had already turned away. The court clerk, who had long been her silent confidant, avoided her gaze entirely for the first time. Isolated and exposed, Cartwright slowly rose from her seat, the gavel lay abandoned on the bench, a symbol of authority now stripped away. She opened her mouth, as though to command and reclaim what was slipping through her fingers, but no words emerged. With measured finality, the marshals led her toward the exit, and the gallery erupted in a chorus of hushed whispers. Standing at the back, Special Agent Bennett observed the spectacle with quiet satisfaction. Justice, it seemed, had a way of balancing the scales when power ran unchecked. Yet the most astonishing twist was still to come. As the heavy courtroom doors swung shut behind the escorted judge, only the echo of her forced footsteps lingered. The room remained taut with unresolved tension, as if no one could quite fathom the magnitude of what had just transpired. For years, she had dictated destinies with a mere flick of her wrist, but now the weight of her own misdeeds had caught up with her. A low, almost imperceptible hum of conversation began to ripple through the gallery, voices rising and falling in waves. Some whispered in sheer disbelief, others nodded as if they had long suspected that something was fundamentally awry. Never had they imagined that justice would come so publicly, right at the prosecutor's table. The once admiring young prosecutor stood motionless, her eyes fixed on her own trembling hands as though she were re-examining every case she had ever argued under Cartwright's iron rule. The bailiff adjusted his belt in a gesture that betrayed a newfound uncertainty, his posture now less rigid, as if freed from an unspoken duty. At the defense table, a man who had anticipated leaving in handcuffs sat utterly frozen, his gaze locked on the empty judge's bench. He had come for a sentencing, yet witnessed a spectacle of accountability that few ever experienced. Lawrence remained standing, absorbing the shifting energy that coursed through the room. It was no longer solely about Judge Cartwright, something much larger was unfolding, a door had been flung open, and a precedent had been set. With deliberate calm, he turned toward Assistant U.S. Attorney Whitaker. Their eyes met in a silent exchange of mutual understanding. The investigation was far from over, Cartwright was but the opening chapter. Whitaker nodded slowly. "We will be in touch regarding the next steps," he stated with measured resolve. Lawrence, adjusting his suit as if shedding the weight of expectation, stepped away from the defense table. He had fulfilled his duty today, yet an unspoken certainty whispered that this would not be the last time he entered a courtroom, not as a defendant, nor merely as a bystander, but as the man determined to ensure that justice remained a living, breathing force rather than an empty word. Outside the courthouse, a modest crowd had gathered. Reporters clutched their microphones, camera crews refocused their lenses, and onlookers, some former defendants, others merely curious, murmured amongst themselves. News of a sitting judge being unseated mid-proceeding had spread like wildfire. Federal marshals had led Judge Cartwright through a side exit, away from the burgeoning chaos, yet the damage was indelible. Her reputation was not merely tarnished, it was utterly obliterated. Stepping outside, Lawrence squinted against the harsh midday sun. He cared little for the media circus swirling around him, this was never about the headlines. With a measured adjustment of his suit and a slow, deliberate exhale, he prepared to depart as Whitaker caught up, his face etched with exhaustion yet glinting with a quiet satisfaction. "We have enough evidence now to push for a full trial," Whitaker remarked, his tone laced with finality. "More than enough, in fact, the evidence your team gathered is airtight." Lawrence offered a brief nod. Whitaker then paused, a dry chuckle escaping him as he posed the inevitable question, "But why undertake this battle?" Lawrence's eyes met his as he replied, "She believed she could act with impunity, thinking that no one would ever hold her accountable." He let the weight of his words settle before continuing, "I simply ensured that she was wrong." Whitaker exhaled slowly, nodding in reluctant admiration. "We could always use more men like you," he murmured. Lawrence did not answer, no words were necessary. Instead, he stepped away from the courthouse steps and melted into the pulsing heart of the city. The struggle for true justice was far from over, and it never would be. Yet today, a significant victory had been won. Unchecked power, it turned out, was a perilous force. Judge Cartwright had flourished precisely because no one ever dared to challenge her reign, until someone finally did. How many among the powerful escape accountability for corruption simply because the world watches in silence? How many lives are shattered by those who treat justice as a trivial game rather than a sacred duty? Though this narrative may echo the contours of fiction, its foundation is built upon all too real truths. In the quiet aftermath of the day's dramatic upheaval, one is left to wonder, have you ever witnessed such stark injustice and felt utterly powerless to intervene?